Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I am the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center of Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. It is a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current systems work, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC. Today's show, which is really important, and we're excited to have it today, is entitled Aging People in Prison, an Ever-Growing and Alarming Situation. The American criminal justice system holds almost 2.3 million people, which is an alarming and ever-growing number, of whom are aged men and women who cannot readily climb stairs, haul themselves to the top bunk, or walk long distances to meals or the pill line. Their old bones suffer from thin mattresses and winter's cold, and many of them need wheelchairs, walkers, canes, portable oxygen, and hearing aids. They cannot get dressed, go to the bathroom, or bathe without help. And they are incontinent and forgetful, suffering from chronic illnesses. Many are extremely ill and dying. Using data from the United States Bureau of Justice Statistics, Human Rights Watch calculates that the number of sentenced federal and state prisoners who are age 65 or older grew an astonishing 94 times faster than the total sentenced prison population between 2007 and 2010. The older prison population increased by 63%, while the total prison population grew by 0.7% during the same period. And by 2030, the population of people aged 50 and older is projected to account for 1/3 of all incarcerated people in the United States, accounting to a staggering 4,400% increase over a 50-year span. So today here at Both Sides of the Bars, we'll discuss what actions advocates are taking to address this phenomenon. Our guest is Ute Ritz-Deutch, the coordinator of the Ithaca, New York chapter of Amnesty International, and the host of the Human Rights and Social Justice program on WRFI Community Radio in Ithaca. Ute teaches at both the State University of New York at Cortland and Tompkins Cortland Community College, and she frequently lectures on human rights topics, including mass incarceration. Ute, welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Andre. And you laid the groundwork already with, your statistics, and definitely elders in prison is a huge problem and something that we do need to address.
Absolutely. And Ute, you've been working on this, right, as an area of focus for you as a professional, as an academic. And so we thought it was important to have you on. And so I guess we'll start for our viewers. Why are so many people in prison in terms of elders? And why is 55 considered old age in prison?
Right. So, a lot of this really goes back to the beginnings of mass incarceration decades ago. We had extreme sentencing. We had mandatory minimum sentences. We had truth in sentencing. We had life without parole sentences, and we had virtual life without parole. So, for example, if somebody gets, 75 years, they're not going to get out of prison alive. So a lot of this really can be traced back to the war on drugs and some of these extremely harsh sentences. And that includes, sometimes just for drug violations, but, across the board, really what slowly been happening is sentencing reform. But what do we do with people who've had sentences of decades? Or what do we do with people who may have had a minimum sentence, of 10 or 15 years, but have been in prison for decades beyond that? So that's why our numbers are so high. It is directly related to mass incarceration policies in this country and in New York State.
And so when you think about that context, Ute, and it's very helpful, how can someone be sentenced, for example, to 15 years to life and then end up serving 30 years. And what does that say about a parole system in New York State? And what is the importance of the composition of the parole board?
Right. So, this is really the difference between determinate and indeterminate sentencing. And a lot of people don't realize the importance. If you have a determinate sentence, you get sentenced for a certain number of years, let's say 5 years, and that's it. But with the indeterminate sentence, you are given a minimum. And for example, you will be eligible for parole after a certain number of years. So let's say if somebody's giving an indeterminate sentence of 15 years, but with the possibility of parole, that means after 15 years, they can start to petition the parole board. And really part of the problem has been that the vast majority of people have been denied parole. And there are several reasons for that. But the composition of the parole board is really, really important to understand. Because if you have a parole board that is composed of members who come from the law enforcement community or, who are former prosecutors, they oftentimes tend to focus on the nature of the original crime. And especially if it was a violent crime, then oftentimes the attitude is, well, this person is too dangerous to be released back into the community. Now, this kind of an attitude really does not allow for any notion of not just clemency, but also rehabilitation, forgiveness. And we do know that as people age, their propensity to engage in violent acts decreases. So, a person who is a teenager or, in their early 20s is very different from a person who is in their 50s. Changes happen in the brain. People get to reflect on what they've done. We're just not the same person we were decades ago. So if instead of having people from a prosecutorial background predominantly on the parole board, we will have people with background in the social services, people who have background in mental health counseling. All of these professionals bring a different set of tools to the table and might be more in tune with this concept of rehabilitation. And most importantly, we need to see the people where they are at now. What kind of progress have they done in the last few decades? Have they worked on themselves? Have they, participated in programs inside the prison? Many people have actually founded programs to help other prisoners. Many elders in prison may have been tutoring younger people in terms of anger management and things like that. So all of these changes, all of that progress, these personal transformations should be considered when somebody moves before the parole board. And, basically denying people parole solely based on the original crime, which we cannot change, right? That's a fact that cannot be changed.
The nature of the crime essentially doesn't change, yet people are denied parole because of the nature of the crime.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Could you repeat that?
No, I was just saying that the nature of the crime doesn't change, yet people are denied parole oftentimes because of the nature of the crime. And like you said, brain science suggests that people do grow and mature over a span of time, especially talking about decades, if they committed an offense in their teenage years, between 18 to 24 years old or so. But the other part of it is, like, a person 15, 20 years later is separate from the act that they committed when they were like 20 years ago. So talk a little bit more about that too, as you were saying, Ute.
Yeah, so, we have here in New York State, I mean, it's a problem across the country too, but here in New York State, we have huge numbers of elders in prison, as you laid out in the beginning of the show. And one reason why we actually use this number, age 55, as elders, because that is how New York State classifies the age in prison. Once you reach 55, you sort of crossed into that category. But it is because there's so much wear and tear on people's health. Many people die in prison when they are in their 50s. So the average life expectancy is much shorter. There is a lot of stress. Sometimes it's not having access to, medical care or preventative care. So, we now have a lot of elders who are basically in need of these extra services. And, having them in prison is not helping anybody at all. And, as they go before these parole boards and they get rejected over and over again, you may have a situation where somebody had a minimum sentence of 15 years and then, they're incarcerated for 30 years or more before they actually get released, so that's a huge problem right now. But I would like to briefly talk about two bills that are being considered in the New York State legislature. And I would also like to bring to the attention of our listeners organizations that are working on those bills.
Yeah, sure. Please. I mean, we know that on the state level, there has been some campaigns to address some of the things that you've mentioned, specifically elder parole and fair and timely parole. So please talk about those things.
Right. So there are two bills that have been introduced to the New York State legislature, and both of them are right now in committee. So they have not yet moved to the floor to be voted on. But we have the so-called elder parole bill, and that bill number is in the Senate as 1415A, and in the Assembly it's A 4231A. No, I'm sorry, that's the fair and timely parole. And the elder parole bill is S15A, and the assembly number is A3475A. So the elder parole bill would basically look at people, elders who are, and again, that's the way the prison system defines it, 55 years or older, and to have served 15 years in prison already. So they had lengthy sentences, they already served 15 years, and it would give them access to the parole board. In other words, they would have the opportunity to plead their case, to demonstrate, that they have made progress, things like that, that there is rehabilitation that has been happening. It would not automatically lead to release. The parole board would still have discretion, but it would give people access to parole. So let's say if somebody was sentenced to 20 years to life, but if this bill were to pass and they've already served 15, they would be able to have their case heard before the parole board, even though without this bill, they would have to wait another 5 years. So again, it's kind of recognizing that elders, do not pose a risk to the community, or, for the vast majority of cases, that is true. It's just, a very tiny fraction of people. But again, the parole board, would still have a discretion. Now, if that bill were to pass, it would immediately make around 1,000 people eligible for parole. So that would not only save lives, because a lot of people do die in prison, but it would also be a way to reunite families. And that's something a lot of people don't necessarily think about. I mean, yes, a person was convicted of a crime, and that person is being, punished for that. But it's not just that one individual. People have family members, they have parents and spouses and children who kind of suffer along. And, it oftentimes means that people who are incarcerated lose loved ones, and they cannot be there for funerals and so on. It's just really heartbreaking. So this would be a critical step toward reducing the number of people with these super long sentences, and it would reduce the number of people who die in prison. So that's the elder parole bill. And again, people age 55 or older who have already served 15 years. And the other one, the fair and timely parole, that one would provide for more meaningful review of parole, and that addresses the issue I spoke to about earlier, namely that oftentimes parole is denied because of the severity of the original crime. So this bill would change the standard of parole by centering release not on the original crime, but on the person's rehabilitation while incarcerated. So the parole commissioners would no longer be able to deny release based solely on the crime for which the person's convicted. So this also would be a meaningful step to ensure fair parole hearings. And, we have in New York dismally low parole release rates, so it would kind of address that. But the third piece, so here I've been talking about the two bills, but the third piece is to fully staff the parole board. We're now understaffed. We can have up to 19 people on the parole board. I think we're up to maybe 15 right now. Mm-hmm. But again, to also look at the composition of the parole board. And that's something that has changed in recent years. And just, having more people who are trained in these fields, like social services or right. mental health, has already led to a greater rate of release among people. So it's kind of important to continue that process.
Absolutely, Ute. And talk to us about some of the organizations that's sponsoring and at least advancing those two bills so that ultimately there'll be a legislative win.
We have the RAP campaign, that's RAPP, and that stands for Release Aging People in Prison. And their website is rapcampaign.com. And you can also find some interesting reports there. So if you go to RAP campaign and then to resources and reports, one of the reports that was just released by Columbia University in October of this year is New York State's new death penalty, the death toll of mass incarceration in a post-execution era. So if people are interested in more, research in facts and figures, you can definitely take a look at that report. There is also basically a campaign. So this is several different organizations coming together. That's the People's Campaign for Parole Justice. And their website is Parole Justice, and then NY for New York, parolejusticeny.com. And you can also look at their campaign platform, which is basically a legislative agenda, and it includes those two bills, and it includes, also efforts to improve the composition of the parole board. But they have some other initiatives as well, for example, that have to do with family unification and also visitation rights, things of that nature. And looking at, the impact of COVID on prisons, because that's another dimension that has just been so difficult, because obviously people cannot socially distance in prison, so many people did not have access to protective gear. Infection rates in prisons are a lot higher than they are in the general population, and people oftentimes just, cannot get the health services that they need. And again, this disproportionately affects our elders, because many of them are already compromised as far as their health goes.
Absolutely. And we have just gotten recent reports from our founder, David Rothenberg, that there's been an uptick in some cases of COVID in Marcy Correctional Facility. So there's a lot happening in New York State, and certainly there has to be interventions in place to support people who are behind the prison gates and walls in New York State to access what they need to prevent the spread of COVID-19 and to make sure that they're getting the treatment that they need if they in fact contracted COVID. So, Ute, in our few remaining minutes, I know that you host WRFI, which is a human rights and social justice program on WRFI Community Radio in Ithaca. Tell us about the shows you've done and what topics that you obviously have done on the show.
Right. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So, I consider myself to foremost be an educator, and I like to do research, but I'm also involved in advocacy. So earlier on the show, you mentioned the Ithaca chapter of Amnesty International that I coordinate. So one of the things that we worked on also was the HALT Act, which is Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement. And that's something we advocated for, I think, for around 7 years, before it finally got passed. So, I'm very interested in the advocacy component. I'm very interested in education. And I have done a few shows on this topic, and I would just like to bring that to people's attention. The podcasts of the show can be found on SoundCloud. So if you go to soundcloud.com/WRFI Human Rights Show, you can find them, and they're listed chronologically. WRFI is community radio in Ithaca, so pretty much volunteer run. But there are 3 shows I would like to bring to your attention. One of them I did almost a year ago, and that was with Jose Saldaña. He's a director of RAP, Release Aging People in Prison, and Jerome Wright, who has been an organizer for the HALT bill. And he's been organizing with CAKE, the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. And both of them have spent many years, decades actually, in prison. And that's another very important component, is to have people who've been personally affected in leadership roles.
Sure.
So there's a show with Jose Saldaña and Jerome Wright that was from November 27th of last year, 2020. There is a show with the survivors, and that was March 19th of 2021. And I'm in conversation with 3 different women who are survivors of violence. And many of them, also survivors of domestic violence, but they are outspoken against this long-term incarceration, saying it does not solve anything, it does not heal the harm that has been done. So that's an important show. And more recently, there's a show with Melissa Tanis and Beth Harris that was October 22nd of this year. And Melissa also is a survivor. And, we talk about the importance of these 2 bills as well. Mm-hmm. So again, if people are interested, look them up chronologically, soundcloud.com/WRFI Human Rights Show.
Thank you so
much. And thank you for allowing me to the shameless plug.
No, absolutely. I think it makes perfect sense, Ute, and we thank you for your work in advocacy and as a radio personality to amplify those issues with leaders like Jerome and Jose and Melissa and others who have been impacted either directly through the criminal legal system or as a survivor in some way as a result. And so we want to make sure that our viewers continue to view both sides of the bars. Again, we were joined by our dear colleague and friend, Ute Ritz-Deutch, who joined us today, and we appreciate her. And, to our guests, Ute, we will certainly have you back here. We thank you for giving us your thoughts and observations about elder parole, about elders in prison, and what is important to address as it relates to older people and aging people who are in prison. We thank you, our viewers, for joining us for all of the thought-provoking discussion. In the meantime, On behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning into Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about Both Sides of the Bars and about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's Fortune, FORTUNESOCIETY.org. That's fortunesociety.org, or go on Facebook and type in the Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and I appreciate all of you joining us here today on Both Sides of the Bars as we continue to look at those things critically. Be well.
We asked you to step in on a very important project for us. In the middle of the pandemic, we knew that there were physically, medically vulnerable people in prison, in jail, in detention, who would not be released unless they had an address, but they were homeless. We rented a building and we asked you to run it. So talk to us about what it's like for you starting up a new building in a pandemic with people with behavioral health issues and huge life challenges.
Sometimes you have to leap off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. One of the reasons why I'm so in love with Fortune is because it's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need. We don't write people off. We invest in people. The same way some individuals and some corporations invest in prisons. We invest in people. My sole purpose for being here was so that I can try to help people the way that I was helped when I finally walked through the doors of Fortune for real. Fortune was kind of forced down my throat initially. I had just got out of prison. I was mandated to go to Fortune for drug treatment. It's been an experience for me. I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means. I can remember when I first walked through the door. I can remember how I wanted to be treated. I can remember how I wanted to be spoken to. And that's the way I treat everybody that comes through there, as if it was me.